So now we've fully understood how to export our reference to an ng model. We've got valid, invalid, touched, pristine, dirty, you name it. We can now begin to start adding our validation messages and then use something like ngIf, which is a perfect use case for our conditional directive, which is then going to show and hide a piece of template when we provide some of these properties as arguments. So we can remove our p-tags with our validation states inside. And what we're going to do is supply an ng container. Now this container is then going to contain our validation messages. So first off, let's just say there's an error. Now if we hit save, you can see that we have our piece of text. So this is fine. However, we obviously want to hide it if it's invalid. So we can say ngIf and then pass in that name.invalid property. If we then hit save, we then see there's an error. If we then add some characters, we can then see it disappear, undo those changes, and we can see that error message. So we're almost there. But of course, when we land on the page, you can see I'm hitting refresh here. We then see this error. This is the whole reason why I showed you these touched, pristine, etc. is because we also want to tie that into our ngIf statements. If we say, I want to only show this if the name is invalid and the name has been touched. So then when we save this, we do not see our validation error. If we then focus and then blur the input, we then see that's an error. So at this point, we are well on our way to handling our validation. However, this doesn't really tie in with a specific kind of message. So how do we do that? Now, the reason we're using ng container is because we're going to contain a bunch of different error messages. For example, if we had min length alongside our required, we can provide a whole chain of error messages inside of here, which we can then show. And what it means is by using this ngIf is we only want to then toggle one of our validation messages if the input as a whole is invalid and has been touched. At this level, we don't really care about what validation message has triggered it. It could be a required error, it could be an input email error, it could be a min length, it could be any kind of pattern or validation error. So that's up to us now to implement those lower level error messages. So let's go ahead and create a div. This is going to be the div that we're going to then toggle with another ngIf, and inside we're going to say name is and then required. So you've probably seen this error message before when you've been using different websites and applications. Now we're going to add donut form -error as the class name, which is then going to allow us to add some styles. So first let's do this. Let's take our error and jump down into our styles array. So we have donut form just before the closing tag. We then want to inherit, we can say &-error. Now we're going to make the font size slightly smaller to begin with, and also just add a color. So for this, I'm going to use hash E66, 2, 6, and 2. So this is a nice pastel-y red, which I've chosen, and we can save things out, click and blur, and you can see it's a bit smaller, and it now catches our eye as a good error message should. So that's the styling part taken care of. I think that's nice and simple. We don't really need to go too overboard. Simpler is definitely better. However, this is going to show regardless of the kind of error. So what we want to do now is look at a new property. If we just do this for a moment, we can say name.errors. We can then use the JSON pipe and save things out. So you can see at the moment we have required as true. So this errors property exists on our ng model, and it's basically an object which holds the validation state. So anytime we want to see if an error is present, we need to start looking at this name.errors property. So if we wanted to then access whether required was available, we then need to do name.errors.required to then get that Boolean value. We need to be a bit more safe. We need to use a safety check. Why? Because if we then type A, our name.errors is no longer an object, it's the value of null. So that means we need to then safety check this name.errors property. Now thankfully Angular has a way built in that we can easily do this. So here we're going to tie things in all at once. We can say, I want to show this element if we have a name.errors, and the error I'm looking for is dot and then required. We can then save things out. We can then jump into our name, blur the input, and we have name is required. Now we're also going to add one more property, and that's going to be a minimum length. So we're going to say the minimum length for a name of a product is going to be 5 different characters. If it's not 5, we need to then display an error message. So we can just go ahead and duplicate this. And we can say the minimum length of a name is 5, which means that we can change this over, this dot required, to a dot minimum length. Now, you may be wondering what this question mark is. This is a safety check in Angular and a TypeScript feature which is really nice. Essentially, it's saying if we have name.errors, then go and try and access this required. If name.errors is not an object, this is a safety check which is not going to then throw an error if our required property doesn't exist. So let's say this out and see how it works. We can then enter some characters, ABC, we can then blur the input. We have minimum length of a name is 5, DEF, and then everything is nice and valid for us. If we then were to remove, we then get name is required. So what's interesting here is we're not actually seeing 2 errors at once because Angular's error object is giving us the errors one at a time. We want to then take care of name is required first. So we could say, okay, and then we get the next error, which means that we can then go and fill in some more details. And the user is then happily understanding what is happening as they go along. So I think this is really nice for us to use an ng container to save us rendering a parent div, which we do not need. We just need to display this form error. What we could do perhaps is use a single div and then inside use an ng switch to then switch out just the piece of text, which might be a nice addition if you want to go and attack that in your own time. So that's it for this lesson. We have successfully learned about implementing validations such as required, the minimum length, how to tie in to an ng container, which I think is a perfect use case for this name.invalid property, and this touched, which means at this point we definitely have an error. So then it's up to us to go and find the particular error. Could be the min length, could be the required. We know that they are then given to us one by one, otherwise we'd have multiple errors displaying all down the page. So in the next lesson, we're going to learn how to start to style these inputs ourselves, and I'm going to talk you through a few global styling options or component-driven styling options that we can have, and why we might adopt a certain approach. That means that with our new knowledge, our invalid and touch properties in mind, this is going to be super easy for us.